Morning and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us again today for our Level Up Leadership webinar. My name is Dawn Lane and I am the Program Development and Implementation Manager for the Massy Learning Institute. I will be sitting in today for Audra Mitchell, Head of the Massy Learning Institute. I'm going to start the morning with a quote by Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great said, "I am not afraid of any army of lions led by a sheep. I am afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion." Now, this quote provides insight as to why leadership is so critical. It is crucial. The person at the helm of a company usually makes the difference between success and the failure of a strategy. Many of us have been fortunate to meet and possibly work with natural leaders, those persons who by instinct do the right thing and turn average people into exceptional performers. Today's leadership session, entitled Reflections on Leadership, What I've Learned Over the Last 40 plus years, will be presented by Mr. Eugene Tiah. And how fortunate we are today to have Mr. Tiah with us to share his journey and the lessons he has learned as he traveled along. So let me share a little bit about Eugene. Eugene Tiah is the Executive Chairman of the Energy and Industrial Gases Business Unit of the Massy Group and has been in this position for just over 6 years. Prior to this position, he served as President of Phoenix Park Gas Processors Limited, PPGPL, for 13 years. He has 37 years of experience in all aspects of process, plant engineering, operations, and overall business management. He has held various senior executive positions in process plant operations management, project management, construction management, and business development, both in Trinidad and the United States of America. Immediately prior to his appointment as president of PPGPL, he held the positions of Director of Special Projects for Natural Gas Liquid Marketing in Houston, Texas, and Systems Manager, Cashion Mustang Hennessy System at Conoco in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Wow. Eugene wears many hats, and I'll just let him share a little bit more of himself as he moves through his presentation. But before we get started, just a little housekeeping to remind you that if you have any questions or comments during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A box. We will have a Q&A segment at the end of the presentation where we will be able to respond to as many of your questions as time permits. If someone posts a question which you wanted to ask, please click the thumbs up icon by that question. This will further help us in selecting questions which you are keen to have answered. Now, it is my pleasure to hand you over to Eugene Tiah. Eugene, welcome to our session today.
Thanks, Dawn. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I know we have a very tight timeline, so I will immediately launch into the presentation. So I'll take control, Dawn, correct? Good morning, everyone. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. Look forward particularly to your comments, your questions. I know we'll have that segment later on. So I've divided up the agenda, and these are the 3 areas that I intend to cover today. And let's start. So the first thing for me, I know this is primarily about leadership, but for me, the real fundamental was, how does one define leadership? And this is a definition that I came across in the early 1990s. that resonated with me. And I think, it's really important to understand the definition, because leadership means a lot to different people. And it really starts with how you define it. And I've highlighted here the aspects that I think are really crucial, at least for me. And really it is about an art. I know there are components that one could define somewhat as a science, but primarily an art of getting others to want to do something that you are convinced that should be done. Now, I've underscored to want to, because for me, leadership is not about coercion or manipulation. Leadership is getting a willing participation in a process where people are incentivized primarily based on intrinsic motivations. We talk a little bit about the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic later on, but to really buy into and own something and move it forward. So that is a common theme that would be resonating throughout or evident throughout my presentation. The other bit has to deal with authentic leadership. And really why this is important to me is that leadership, at least from my perspective, shouldn't appear to be contrived. I mean, I think we all are very able to easily distinguish between something that is contrived and something that is authentic. And usually things that are authentic are more appealing to us. We engage more meaningfully when something occurs to us as being authentic. And I think the same applies for leadership. There must be a fit between who the person is and their leadership style or their leadership approach. And I've kind of put some sub-bullets in there to indicate, what are some of the key things that drive authenticity, and that will come out. For example, I put in there how your early life experiences shape you. So I'll use an example. For example, I am very comfortable with diversity, and why? Why is that? Because if I look at my early childhood, one, I'm a product of a biracial marriage. So I'm biracial, if you were to classify me. My parents are even more diverse in that my mother was a fervent Roman Catholic and my father was an atheist. My mother was very liberal and my father was very conservative. My mother was born and grew up in Europe and is a European by descent, and my father is from the Caribbean. So very early on, diversity was ever present in our household, and there had to be, a drive for purpose that united in such a household. If I use another example, we moved to the Caribbean when I was 5 years old and had to integrate into a very different culture, very different setting, and that had to be done very, very quickly. So I had to not only integrate, but to align in a very short period of time at a very early age. So for me, change management was something that was, again, very early developed in my childhood. So I became very, very change tolerant. So those are examples that, things that are part of me that I am very comfortable with in my leadership approach that for me are authentic, and generally in interactions I feel occur as authentic. And similarly for what motivates me, and then what are my inherent core values, what are the values that have been developed in me at a very early age during my formative years. The other common theme that I'll speak a bit about is this idea of contingency theory of leadership. And this is just a broad theory, but is very, very important for me because I am a contingency theorist. I do believe that, yes, one may have a predominant approach, but I do believe that context, objectives, and so do shape what leadership style can be effective. I'll use an example to underscore that point. In my career, I've done different roles, and one of the roles that I've played for some time, particularly when I managed process plants, was that of incident commander, and that role required the lead for emergency situations. So whether it was crisis communications or organizing for emergency, a fire or an explosion, really required a well-rehearsed approach which had a command and control style. And a command and control style was really going to be very effective in that setting. And the last common theme is that really your development is your responsibility. And I'll underscore that when I make some comments about, my own career over time. Some distinctions and useful constructs that I think are important. I think these are generally understood, but sometimes for my own interactions, I sense that they're not deeply understood, and that there are distinctions between leadership and management. And the two have different focuses. And this list here on the slide is intended to highlight, from my perspective, some of the significant differences. And you could have a reality where you have a good manager who is a poor leader and a leader who is a poor manager. Generally, we look for, depending, at least in an organizational context, we look for both at the managerial level. We want our managers to be good leaders. And when you look at the list, you could see why the two see how the two complement each other, and particularly in periods of rapid change and a dynamic environment, why a strong manager and a strong managerial approach may be necessary but not sufficient. You do need the ability to align and motivate people to transform, to have a transformative agenda. You need some people who could capture the hearts and minds of people. And that is where the leadership dimension becomes really, really important. So this is a useful construct and one to keep in mind. This is what I'm going to speak to. So when I looked at the audience today, I saw out of the 196 people registered, 15% at least had the title of manager. So I saw those as managers, and 12% had the title of supervisors. So clearly, I'm dealing with a very diverse audience, and people trying to kind of get a sense of how does one look at leadership, if we're talking about leadership in the context of a career. This is what I've put up here is a slide. In my early career, I worked for Conoco when Conoco was owned by DuPont. And DuPont is a global powerhouse in the chemicals business, and has a global presence and has had a global presence for many decades. Maybe is one of those companies that I believe has a history of more than 100 years of successful existence. And DuPont at that time had partnered with an emerging firm called Novations Research. And they were a group of academics from Harvard and from other Ivy League business schools that had thought long and hard about this whole concept of careers. And they had conceptualized and had promoted with a concept or an approach of a career stage model. And I got introduced to this in the early 1990s, 1998, 1991, I think I became aware of this. And I found this to be very helpful for me in my career, in contexting my career in terms of stages, and in particular with the idea that one contributes differently at different stages. And then there are different, performance expectations, different roles, different transformation and transition issues, and clearly different performance requirements at different stages. So this model, and then I'll talk a bit about it a little later, has been extremely helpful for me in helping me think about my own career as I progressed through my career, as well as help me, in making choices that may have had trade-offs at various times. So sometimes one has a choice, for example, between a promotion and a lateral move. And you know, when you look at the pros and cons of a promotion versus a lateral move, sometimes you think of the promotion likely will result in more compensation. The lateral move may not. The lateral move may afford the opportunity for, you know, more diverse experiences and maybe develop some capabilities in a particular area. The promotion similarly may offer those. But ultimately, one has to make a choice. If one has a context of a longer perspective on one's career, it becomes, in my view, a lot easier to make those choices. So I'd like you to kind of, this again is a useful construct that I have found helpful, and I'll refer to it throughout the presentation. Now, taking that construct, one of the things that I got exposed to was the idea of, you know, dimensions of development and how those dimensions, you know, what were those dimensions? So this was a model that I became aware of very early in my career as well, that there were dimensions and one needed to have, you know, a balance in terms of one dimension development. So this framework was one where they had business direction, implementation, networking and team building, people development and leadership. And then in each of those, there were subcategories for each of those dimensions. And then where this came to life for me was in the next slide, where for each of those was developing and applying profiles for each of the stages. So for example, for business expertise, you'd see these bullets under there. So if I were in stage 1 in my career, these were the areas that I would need to or would like to, you know, have covered in terms of my own development and have some competency and proficiency in. And then this kind of, you know, said, well, you know, the next question is what types of jobs would give me those types of, you know, opportunities to develop those competencies in those specific areas. So equally for each of all of the other dimensions, as I had shown earlier, this was built out for each of those areas and then created sort of a roadmap for me as to which jobs would give me the opportunity to develop in those capabilities in those areas. And this next slide here really kind of, you know, gives you a view of, and I'm sharing, you know, what I did throughout my career. So I'll use a few examples. So the icons on the left really represent the dimensions that you would have seen before. So the top with the $ and the compass is really business direction. The target is implementation. The yellow is networking. The other icon with a chalkboard and people is really people development. And the last icon is really leadership. You know, steering the ship is the icon that I've used for that. So I give you an example of, you know, how I focused in my career throughout the stages. So my first job, just using as an example, where I started, you know, developing competence in people development is when I left secondary school. I was actually at just completed A-levels, and I was deciding what to do. My primary choice was medicine, but I was in two minds. I didn't really know whether medicine was, you know, the career for me. And I decided to take a gap year. And the gap year after completing A-levels, I decided, well, I was asked if I would teach at the college that I attended, and to teach up to the level, O-level, ordinary level, then it was the GCE level, probably at the CXC level now, math, physics, and chemistry. So I was 18 years old and I undertook that job to teach mathematics, physics, and chemistry up to people that were up to the O-level area or the CXC level area now. And that was an early introduction to developing skills in understanding how people learn, understanding how to keep people's interest in the learning process, etc. Because I put in parent and husband here, in that, I mean, most of us have fulfilled that role and understand that role. And that what, development opportunities come with that, and responsibilities, of course. And then I had, a very structured approach to developing my primary area of my profession, which was engineering. So I then, embarked on a development process to progress through the engineering ranks to a senior or chartered engineer over many years of focused work in engineering. So I was there as a primary or stage one developer, and developing, this core competence in my profession. And while I was doing that, I was also doing work whenever there were plant opportunities and times when the plant was down, developing the opportunity to lead teams. So I took on the role of a supervisor or team lead, and led large activity, which was very intense over short periods, sometimes a month, sometimes a little longer than that, where a lot of work, very complex and diverse work, needed to be done. And I usually led activity like that. So that started developing my ability in stage two, which was really getting things done through others and working, moving from independent contributor to more into the, from dependent to the independent, into the interdependent area. And similarly for the other roles that I have there, and I did, perform as a coach and a mentor. And then I started doing further postgrad work in areas in engineering that I had interest in, and completed that. So I kept my approach to lifelong learning and developing. And then stage 3 and stage 4, I then started doing a lot of more managerial roles in very diverse interests. So I did a lot of project management work. I worked on projects from as small as, a few million US dollars to hundreds of millions of US dollars over time, leading those projects, developing those projects, etc. I did commercial roles where I led commercial teams. I led business development activity, both in Trinidad and abroad. I continued developing, my change capabilities through undertaking roles that I really found to be initially challenging, where I had to lead diverse teams in different cultures. And that kind of built, again, capabilities in those areas. I mentioned expatriates role. I then lectured in engineering for a number of years at the master's level at the university. I did a lot of coaching and mentoring. I then went back and picked up further work, postgrad work in the area of finance, and completed an MBA in finance to build that capability and deeper knowledge in the finance area. I undertook a role as a country manager for a multinational for a period that, again, developed another set of capabilities. And then I started undertaking a lot of roles in leading professional associations that I was involved in. So I was involved in engineering associations, I was involved in industry associations, and I kind of started taking leadership roles in chapters of those associations. And then I started transitioning to stage 4, where I took up more roles in CEOs and executive chairman, both in the private and public sector, and continued that, and continued over time leading initiatives and continuing to develop capabilities. So, some of it developed over time, all not necessarily within the context of a very structured blueprint. But when I look back over time, it fit very nicely into the stages, and the choices that I made were related to the stages that I was in. So I took a lot of time in stage 1 developing a strong base, and similarly in stage 2 and 3, so that when I got to stage 4, if you want to look at it as a pyramid, if you want to use that metaphor, the base was fairly strong, and that was something that I could draw on as I met the stage 4 challenges. This is another construct that I spoke about earlier on with regard to, particularly with regard to leadership, in that I mentioned that I'm a contingency theorist, and I do believe that there's a role and a place for, different approaches to leadership. So over time, I've studied and paid a lot of attention to different approaches to leadership, and understanding them deeply, and understanding when and where those approaches could be effective. So I've listed some here just for, illustrative purposes, but each has its role and context. Some are going to be more effective in some circumstances, some are not. For example, if you're doing a big change initiative that is occurring, my view is that you would want to be predominantly approaching that in a transformational approach to leadership, in that you would want to have, a clear purpose and a vision with goals, and, you want to win people's hearts and minds into moving into an area that would be unfamiliar. If you're doing something that is routine, maybe more of a transactional approach, maybe more effective. Again, the kind of common theme here is that you need to manage the tension between a contingency approach or to leadership, in that one that considers context and what you're trying to achieve, as well as, of course, the authenticity that I mentioned earlier. Now, when you kind of think of Massy and other companies, they clearly have, drawn on these various approaches to leadership and have put forward a view that, again, this is a view that this approach is going to be generally effective, and, is the preferred approach to apply. And I think that is very powerful. But it doesn't preclude flexing in other areas depending on what you're trying to achieve. So I'll go to, what I have adopted over the years as my preferred approach. Again, I feel this works well with who I am, and as well, as I mentioned before, I do flex into other approaches depending on what I'm trying to achieve. But this is my predominant approach. And you'd see the last box as willing cooperation. So it kind of goes back to, what resonates for me in terms of how I define leadership. And then from how I define leadership, that is what I am trying to get to. I want people to want to, as opposed to have to, or to be coerced to. And I see two areas of focus to that. I have defined what I call professional leadership, which speaks to, direction, process, and coordination. And then I see a personal dimension, which has to deal with what I've listed there as what you may want to classify as the softer aspects, which is more of, aligning with, people in an authentic way. So with regard to the professional, I mean, these are the things that, when I look at affecting, some moving in a particular direction, these are the things that I try to work on, being very clear on my purpose, being very clear on my vision and my mission, being very clear on processes that I'm going to use, whether they be strategic processes or other processes. And then I'm very, very structured in my approach to coordination, getting everyone aligned. And I'll give some examples of the things that I typically do in those areas to achieve those objectives. And then on the personal side, I mean, I see these things as really important, and I've experienced different things at different stages of my career where these things are really important. So for example, when I supervise a lot of technical people, what I learned very early on is that competence is really important, particularly technical competence. And that if you're supervising really technical people, they expect you to be competent. So expertise in this context doesn't only mean technical expertise, but it may mean as well expertise in management, as I mentioned before, expertise in leadership, etc. Trust, I know this one is one you well understand and appreciate, that this is really crucial. If you are going to want to get willing cooperation, people have to trust you. And I've given some examples of the components that constitute trust. Caring, people expect that there is sincere caring in the interactions, and we've done a lot in listening, we've done a lot in empathy, and those really speak to our core value of caring. Sharing and transparency is another one that sometimes is underplayed, but really crucial. And again, people need, if people are going to willingly want to cooperate, they need to be empowered. They need to have the necessary information and access to what is going on, and so this whole concept of sharing and transparency. And then, of course, morals. I mean, the idea of integrity and fairness and justice in the interactions, really, and from my perspective, really crucial. And then what I've done, in the remaining slides, is I've put a little more definition to, each of these areas into how-to in the professional side of leadership. So these are structures and processes that I would use over in various roles that I've held over time, to ensure that the professional side of the leadership is addressed in terms of how do you set direction, the processes that are used, etc. Similarly for coordination, I know we're familiar with this. I mean, most of you either conduct planning sessions, budgeting processes, enterprise risk management processes. You have your meetings, and all of these are intended to assure coordination and alignment on a consistent basis. On the how-to on the personal side, the competence. I mean, you have to, undertake your own development plan. You need to take responsibility for that. I highlighted that as a common theme. And you have to, build your competencies over time. And these are just some, bulleted items of how one goes about this. So these are some examples of how I've gone about this personally over time in building my competence. On the caring side, again, what I've done here is listed some of the things that I've practiced over time that is authentic to me, that in my own view, if one were to say, is caring demonstrated? These are some of the things that I think help building this area. In trust, I mean, you're very familiar with that. Most people know this one very well, but I've taken the time to list some of the things that, in my view, help creating a climate of trust or help developing trusting relationships. And similarly for sharing, what I've done here is kind of, again, detailed what I think has worked for me over the years in terms of demonstrating and building this area of sharing, right? I mean, one, for example, that is very difficult for leaders and senior people to do is really number 4, right? Stop monopolizing airtime at meetings. Let people speak, encourage participation, be very, very aware of how much time you're actually speaking at meetings versus, how much time your constituents and other members of your team are speaking, etc. How you empower people to make decisions, whether you make all the decisions or others make decisions. All these things constitute, in my mind, the whole concept of sharing and this aspect for the personal side of leadership. And then again, with regard to moral code of conduct, I mean, all of these things actually get codified. So I do genuinely believe in having, well-developed processes for fairness. So I would advocate for, a just and fair culture and codify that into what does a just and fair culture mean, and how does one, act and behave in a context of a just and fair culture. So for example, for our portfolio, we have a just and fair culture a policy, and the idea behind that was to just not have hollow words, but to define it and refine it so that people understand what it means to have a just and fair culture, and how what what is required. And similarly, again, the idea here is moving all of these things from, just a banner statement to specific actions and behaviors that are done consistently over time and that are encouraged and encouraged through positive reinforcement, that recognizing that when people do these things, that they get the positive reinforcement to continue to want to do these things. So I'm just very mindful of my time, Dawn, and I know that the important thing here is to convey what I needed to convey, and also to pause and to allow for questions on what I've discussed and communicated. I know it's a lot to probably digest in a short period of time, but I'll pause for questions. So I'll come out of presentation mode, Dawn, and sure, I'll pause for questions. Yeah.
So that's great, Eugene. Thank you so much. So now I will hand you over to Renee Barnett, who will be moderating our Q&A segment. Renee?
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Mr. Tiah. Good morning to everyone. So our first question this morning is from Roxy. Thank you for this insightful presentation. Please, can you advise how one creates this type of plan for their life after they have had no structure for the first 20 years of work versus career?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, it's never too late. I suppose that's my comment, right? I suppose that what you may want to do is go back and see which areas or stages of your career that you've paid attention to and how you've developed them, and look forward. What are the areas that you would like to advance in, and really give a lot of thought to that in terms of your choices and your actions. I know it's not going to be easy. What I'm saying here is ideally, for early stage career developers, but it doesn't, of course, preclude people who are at mid stage and moving, towards later stages of their career.
All right, thank you. We have our next question is from an anonymous person. Did you develop your path to leadership over time, or did you identify in yourself, let's say in your early 20s, aspiring to such a senior level?
Truth be told, I didn't start off with saying, that is exactly where I want to be, and so, there was a certain evolution. I would say that one thing that I have found to be quite helpful is that, and I know different people have different levels of comfort, I am typically one who would volunteer for difficult things. I just, that is part and parcel of who I am. If I have a fear, I confront that fear. So early in my career, for example, early stages in my early 20s, I had a little bit of apprehension about public speaking. I looked for every opportunity I could find to public speak. I've done things, for example, I remember as a child, I use this one as a child because this kind of illustrates again, how things have impacted me over time. When I was a child, where I grew up close to the sea, there was a old railway bridge that crossed the river mouth, and on the side of it was a water pipeline. So, and kind of, maybe just judging now today, from today's perspective, it probably was about a 12 or 20 inch pipeline, and the river width was probably about 20 to 30 feet, or maybe more, maybe about 50 feet at that point, or maybe more. And as kids, my first encounter was that with a little friend who crossed on the pipeline, walked over the pipeline, and got to the other side, and helped me get over, encouraged me to walk on the pipeline as well. The drop to the river mouth was about 30 or 40 feet. But, he gave me good encouragement. He said, just don't look down, look at me and continue walking. And, that stuck with me. What it said is that you need to, at times, confront the things that, are difficult. Look for opportunities to develop that competence and skill and go after it. Yes, you'll have sweaty palms, for example. You'll grab the podium. You won't let go of it the first time you speak at a podium, etc. Right? But after a while, you'll be surprised how, comfortable you get. But it requires, a stick-it-to-iveness to keep going at it and, keep working on it. So, I mean, I would strongly encourage that. And yes, all the time it is not clear as I've made it in terms of a roadmap. But, even with, a vague understanding that gets developed over time, seeking out opportunities to develop, new opportunities come for you to grow, and you can kind of get more options that way to continue your career. But you need to kind of step out and volunteer to do things.
Okay, thank you. I like that. I like that response. Our next question is from Janelle. Thank you for this insightful presentation. Have you changed your leadership style over the years to adapt to the various leadership positions you were in?
Not really. I mean, I've codified it a bit more over time into what I've described there. However, I mean, substantially, that has been my preferred approach over time. Whether it was as codified as it is now, kind of reflecting back and putting everything into words. But that has been my substantial style, and what I've done, as I've described, is I've flexed. So, for example, as I indicated, when I was in the role of incident commander, I mean, I had strongly to focus on a command and control style. I needed to effect rapid response to a crisis, and there was no time to sit and have a dialogue as to what everyone thought about the crisis. It was define roles. Your operations chief, these are duties and responsibilities. You're head of communication, we need a statement for the media prepared, you need to get on with this, etc. So I've flexed my styles depending on what role I've been in and what exactly was the objective that I was trying to achieve. But if I were to look at where I sit in the middle of the road, it would be what I've described, what I've generally found to be effective for me and what resonates as being authentic for me.
Thank you so much. Our next question is from Keisha. Thanks, Eugene, for a fantastic presentation. I have two questions. What are some common mistakes you see leaders in organizations make? And secondly, are there any easy wins that we can put into practice almost immediately to help with this journey?
Yeah, so some of the the mistakes I see is the kind of the enlarged ego and the I am the boss kind of mindset that sometimes prevails, and that sometimes comes across as do as I say and here are your instructions, and so it kind of comes across as more of an authoritative style, an authoritative approach. And as I said, there are times when that could be effective, but if generally applied, you could find situations where it will clearly not be effective. So again, I would think that one has to be very, very careful. I mean, when you're particularly thrust into a very senior role, you could kind of get this very boss mindset that I'm on top of the pyramid, and you tend to sometimes also lose connectedness with everyone in your organization. And I would say that again, be accessible, be available, spend more time listening than advocating, and be very mindful of when you're coming across as being authoritative, ask versus tell as much as you can. Those are things that I think clearly young leaders need to be mindful of when they embark on their leadership journey.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question coming in from an anonymous person. In your career path, it is great to see that at the top you have husband and father. How have you been able to maintain that work-life balance?
Oh, that's a really good question. When I started my career, my wife is a professional as well in different disciplines, and we both started off, full-time careers, working very, very intently, and so And a lot of it came from, being very clear again with sharing the responsibilities for parenting and for the household, and being very clear that, notwithstanding the various demands, that we each had these roles and we each had a responsibility for the various aspects. So, for example, based on my wife's job, it was easier for her to pick up the children. Based on my job, it was easier for me to, assist with the home lessons and other things. And we kind of took a very early approach of being very clear as to who was doing what. And then there were times when I would have to stop doing particular things or curtail certain activities so that she could advance in a particular area. Truth be told, she took a decision in mid-career that, she wanted to focus more on the children, and she exited, her professional life and took up, more volunteering to do other aspects in her life. And that was a choice that was a difficult one that she felt she wanted to make. So that's my kind of story, right? So I think the central thing there, though, is that, at least for me, there was, joint and several approaches to decision making. So we sat, we chatted, we decided, we agreed, and then we acted. I mean, didn't always work out well. Sometimes there were arguments about different things, but that's how it goes sometimes.
All right, we have JM here with a question. Have you noticed any difference in managing one generation to the next?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, again, parenting offers this, great opportunity to actually understand, different generations, right? So, I mean, what I learned a lot, I mean, when I was at Conoco and working in the United States, one of the things that I took away that was really, I think for me, very powerful, is that when I looked at the professionals, actually what they did is they volunteered a lot of their times in the schools and in other areas. And what that did is what not only enabled them to make a contribution, but gave them a great connectedness with different generations. They understood, the thinking and so. So to your point, I mean, I try to remain connected through, very close and deep relationships with my children, deeply understanding, how they think. I mean, I am fortunate to have access to other generations because I do things with schools and other things as well that keeps me somewhat connected with how kids think. And my wife volunteers a lot of her time in the primary and secondary schools. And then, she asked me to do particular work on some of the assignments and so. So those things kind of give me opportunities to really deeply understand or more completely understand, what drives the thinking, what is important, how people think about specific things, and then to bring that into the workplace as well too. I mean, generations now, in my generation, you were told. I mean, my first experience in the workplace was command and control, right? We really don't want to know what you think. You just do this, right? That was my early experience, and believe me, I know that in today's world, if you attempt that kind of approach, you're not going to really get a lot of willing cooperation from Generation Y.
Yes, that's very true. Thank you. All right, we have Anderson Mohammed here from Massy Gas Products. You mentioned intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Kindly explain.
Okay, so in the extrinsic motivators typically are things that are tangible, like, for example, money and positions and other things, right? Those things motivate. So, for example, a bonus is an example of an extrinsic motivator. Intrinsic motivator is something that deeply drives you. Let me use an example. When I was a child, I loved to know how things work. So, I mean, I was the first to disassemble the bicycle to figure out how the mechanisms work and so, and to try to attempt to put it back. So for me, an intrinsic motivator is knowing how things work, deeply how things work, getting an appreciation for that. For me, learning is an intrinsic motivator. I like to learn. I like to read. I like to get a deeper understanding of things, etc. Those are intrinsic motivators. You need a combination of two, but the more enduring one for me is intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation, there's this saying that there's a point in time in which money no longer motivates. Now it depends on where you are in your career and what your needs are. One could say, well, if I have $10 a month and I need $100,000 a month, and you'll be very motivated by getting to that. But if I were to make that $1 billion a month, would that drive you significantly more? I mean, it's questionable, right? So the view is that you need this kind of strong balance between intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, and that there are times when you need to understand that intrinsic motivators are clearly more enduring.
Okay, agreed. Yes, thank you so much. Our next question is from Aaron. Thank you for this presentation. At what stage in one's life should they create a formal career plan? And should this be done with a manager or a team leader, or should you engage a coach or mentor?
I think as early as you can. I mean, that's my life lesson, right? I mean, I discovered a lot of these kind of constructs and structures in the early 1990s, and at that time I was just moving into my 30s, right? I mean, when I started becoming very, very aware of all of these things. But I would strongly encourage this at early stage career. I mean, and maybe this is a construct that, for example, MLI may want to consider developing some area there, and guidance in that area. And maybe that could be made available. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, your career is your responsibility, so I would expect that you would drive that. But I would say as early as you can in your career, and then with regard to the other aspects of the question, and then look deeply at engaging your manager and your supervisor in that process, because I do also hold the view that there should be targeted development conversations, conversations that say, this is my career aspiration. And then, your supervisor says, yes, I understand that. These are the opportunities that exist to advance that career. Or sorry, at this point in time, no opportunities exist in this area. However, I do understand what you're looking for, and maybe I could facilitate it in another way at an maybe later date. So it does set the stage for a really good conversation with regard to development, where the person comes prepared to say, what are their career aspirations, where they would like to be, what areas they would like to develop in, and the supervisor, the manager, then has the other side of the conversation, which in the business context, this is what I see, and that's could be a very powerful conversation.
Yes, agreed. Thank you. Our next question here, well, from an anonymous person. What roles did your previous bosses play in your development and career path?
It varied. I was fortunate at some times to have, like when I was in my very structured engineering development area, I had a boss who was a mentor and a coach. And, he gave me all the feedback and the guidance that I needed. At other times, I was there alone, in that my boss was somewhere else, literally, mentally and otherwise. And it was really, my goal to get to where I needed to. So over my career, I found, it varies. And I think the key message that I'm hoping to leave is that your career is your responsibility, and that you need to drive it. Sometimes you'll be fortunate to find a good coach and a mentor, a really supportive boss. Sometimes you'll find someone who is so focused on themselves and their interests that you're not going to get the attention that you think you need.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. Can you identify 2 positive parallels in leadership within the different areas of work, public, private, and internationally?
Yeah, let's say public and private. I mean, I have found, I mean, again, business, when I look at business, business is a means to an end, right? I mean, the economic performance within a country is towards an end. And business serves a purpose, right? You know, if I look at Massy's business and I look at, you know, distribution, for example, it serves a purpose, right? I mean, what the country expects is an efficient mechanism to get goods in and out of the country as it requires it. So it serves a national purpose, and it is more efficient to have it done by the private entity than a public entity. Is done more efficiently. So there are parallels, and I think all is towards the common good, right? Which is, you know, in a country context, advancing the country's agenda. So there are roles, you know, in leadership in the private sector and the public sector. I've served on state boards with the goal to give back and to enable, you know, me bringing to the table, hopefully, some, you know, capability to advance a national agenda. And then internationally, I mean, participated, for example, I use an example, I participated in a national awards. I sat as a judge for a number of years in a international award for innovation called the Stevie Awards. And this is, you know, a global thing. And just looking at the submissions, I mean, just getting aspect and appreciation of, you know, when we compare, you know, our Caribbean focus on innovation and so compared to what I was seeing in Germany, what I was seeing in, you know, in Europe, and so coming in as some of the submissions from the Middle East, etc. I mean, gave some insights as to areas that, you know, we could, you know, aspire to in terms of development, in terms of structure of programs that encourage innovativeness, etc. So yes, I think there are, you know, all of these things are interlinked, and, you know, there's I think ultimately, you know, one is if you look at it from a country perspective, you know, how does this advance the country's agenda in terms of, you know, ensuring that the country's objectives, economic, social, development, and others are met. And then from an international perspective, because the country fits within a, you know, a global framework, you know, how does this contribute to long-term growth and stability of the world, which then enables, you know, the country to continue advancing. So I see the interconnectedness of all of this.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I hand you back over now to Dawn.
Thank you, Renee. And a special thank you again to you, Eugene, for being here today and sharing not just your leadership journey, but how to build a career and how to be authentic and caring as we build the competencies and the skills that we will need on our own journeys. So thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
So go ahead, Eugene.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, if there are, you know, further questions, Renee could route them to me, and, you know, if there are people who have declared who they are and would like a response, certainly I'll take the time to respond to their questions via email, whatever.
Excellent. Thank you for being so generous. So it's that time again, everyone. I want to thank you so much for being here. We've come to the end of another MLI webinar, a leadership series webinar, and thank you for joining. Remember to look out for our flyers announcing our upcoming webinars and, of course, our paid programs. So until next time, remember to level up. Take care. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.